Hi, I'm James Lamont, Director of the Vidine Center for Rural Economic Development at the University of Minnesota Crookston. I would like to welcome you to Part 7 of our supply chain educational series in response to COVID-19. Today we're going to talk about dairy. In our first part of this discussion, we are going to talk about farm to fridge, basically how in a normal supply chain environment, milk moves from the farm into your refrigerator. The process begins at one of 50,000 dairies in the United States. That number could be a little higher, a little lower, depending on what source you subscribe to. From there, the milk is extracted and moved into cooling tanks, typically on the farm. That raw product is typically moved to a processing facility where a number of tests occur to ensure quality assurance. And also at the processor, the milk is homogenized, pasteurized, packed, and then shipped. From there, trucks take the product to typically a distribution mechanism, whether it's a distribution facility or some type of farmer's market. And then from there, it makes its way into retail. Moving into COVID-19 and its impact on dairy, something happened very quickly. Basically, the largest consumers of milk in the United States pretty much shut demand off immediately. That particular consumer was the federal government. Typically, the programs include the school lunch program, correction programs within the justice system. And as schools shut down, demand declined drastically. Simultaneous to that, there was an 80% demand decline within the restaurant industry. So, as restaurants and hospitality industry businesses were shrinking their usage of milk because of COVID-19 and shutdowns, the biggest customer, this being the federal government, also stopped purchasing because of the school lunch program, which was no longer needed, at least in the capacity it was used prior to COVID-19. Basically, for most dairy farmers, it was actually less expensive for them to just dump their raw product versus actually transporting it. So that's why you saw pictures from Wisconsin and other parts of the country with farmers basically dumping their milk. Simultaneously, there was a shortage in retail stores because of people moving to home and because of the erratic behavior associated with shopping. So there was a run on milk, eggs, other products that we've talked about. So as you had this erratic behavior from the customer, a shutdown and major decline with the largest customers, coupled with these behaviors and the oversupply, basically the logistics network was unable to basically match consumer demand to supply. As a result, we had major choke points within distribution capacity, so they couldn't necessarily feed the retail customer. But at the same time, a lot of this milk was staying back at the farm because it was more costly to transport it. So, in the aggregate, roughly $3 billion was lost to dairy farmers. And it seems as though it's going to take a few more months for this to resolve itself, just due to the fact that the next school year doesn't start until September of 2020. And naturally, that is dependent on how the pandemic progresses.
Hi, I'm James Lamont, Director of the Vidine Center for Rural Economic Development at the University of Minnesota Crookston. I would like to welcome you to the Food Supply Chain series. This week, we will discuss the dairy food supply chain, its implications across the country, as well as unique ideas that have been employed by organizations across the country to meet supply chain needs. I would also like to thank Agmark at the Iowa State University for sponsoring this event. I am going to go ahead and introduce panelist one, Whitney Atkins. Whitney?
Thanks, James. I appreciate the opportunity. A little bit about my background in the association. Again, Whitney Atkins. I'm the Vice President of Marketing for the International Dairy Deli Bakery Association out of Madison, Wisconsin. And we service retailers, wholesalers, manufacturers in those business segments. And being here in Madison, it's an honor to talk a little bit about the industry and the dairy industry with an expert like Dave. So look forward to today's panel.
Thank you, Whitney. I'd also like to introduce Dave Scable, a farmer and member of several boards. Mr. Scable?
Good afternoon. I'm the dairy farmer in Preston, Minnesota. My wife and I milk 130 cows, farm about 250 acres of predominantly corn and alfalfa hay to feed our cows. And I'm also the board chairman at Foremost Farms USA. Foremost is the upper Midwestern dairy cooperative of 1,000 members in 7 states: Minnesota, Iowa, Wisconsin, Illinois, Indiana, Ohio, and Michigan. We collect and market and manufacture about 6 billion pounds of member milk annually from our members. We manufacture cheese, both Italian and American. We have whey product manufacturing. If you're into the cheese business, you have to do something with the whey. We make some butter, and we also sell whole milk to bottlers and other manufacturing, infant formula, yogurt making, and the like. So I'm looking forward to the discussion as well.
Well, thank you, Dave and Whitney, for joining us today. Your perspective is invaluable given where you sit within the industry. So thank you again. I'm going to go ahead and start with the first question, and this will be for you, Dave, and then Whitney, you'll have an opportunity to respond to it as well. Dave, in the aggregate, how did COVID-19 impact your industry, both from a regional level as well as nationally, if you will?
Biggest thing was the disruption in the supply chain when the stay-at-home orders came in and things shut down. Overnight, the American people went from eating half of their meals outside the home to probably 85 to 90% in the home. And that immediately changed their buying habits. They had a run on grocery stores basically. And the supply chain was not able to keep up with that. It was not able to change overnight. So you had manufacturers that were heavy in food service suddenly had a precipitous or catastrophic drop in demand. And those supplying the retail level couldn't get enough to them in time. The dairy industry, like everybody else, has gone to just in time, both inventory and managing and everything. So when you saw shopping carts full of milk, you know, a husband or wife going home with 8 gallons of milk in their shopping cart where they normally might buy once a week, the bottling system was unable to keep up with that. And at the same time, back to the food service side, you had businesses that were ready to sell to restaurants and the like had nowhere to go with their materials product, and a lot of them ended up trying to give some of that away. And the packaging is so different between the two that you can't change the industry overnight to meet that supply. It takes lead time, investment, and that. So demand got really choppy. Like I said, the food service demand fell off almost completely, and the retail side jumped a lot. And then 3 or 4 weeks later, the food service demand started coming back somewhat. I think a lot of those buyers cleaned out their pipelines, and then they started needing supply in a hurry. So that was part of it. You did see videos and hear about milk going on the ground, which is hard to understand. You're seeing runs on product, yet there's milk going on the ground. I think the reasons I explained was part of that. So it's come back in balance a little bit. You know, some of that food service is getting steady, but we're still not sure what direction, you know, we head in the long
run. Thank you, Dave. Whitney?
Sure, absolutely. 100% agree with all Dave's comments. Some of the same ones I had, and you know, we saw it from a broad perspective as well as we service retailers and really trying to figure out where consumer trends were and behaviors and how they're going to settle down. And I know today's panel is about dairy and that supply chain and how that works. Dave mentioned cheese, which is an industry we service as well. And then if you just look at overall from a grocery perspective in the brick and mortar retail and how that works, from bakery to deli and dairy, and he talked about the packaging and those type of things. And really, I hope Dave would agree, we saw a shift in consumer behavior pretty quick where it relates to dairy and the products. And people are starting to cook at home, and they're starting to look for different ways to cook from home and what that means in the ingredients. So absolutely impacted demand as well. So we just continue to watch those and see those. You know, it's absolutely an impact on the experience at a brick and mortar store. Grocery retail for a long time, in my opinion, has, in my experience, worked to make these perimeter departments and fresh departments of dairy, deli, bakery an experience. And now all of a sudden they rely heavily on traffic. So how do you get people over there in that experience while our grocery industry had become essential employees overnight to the consumer and what that looked like. So total shift, total shift in how they got the products from e-commerce, and how do we continue to grow that and shift that availability there as well.
Thank you, Whitney. Whitney, why don't you start with our next question? With respect to the industry as a whole, what do you see as the biggest threats and opportunities within this industry as a result of the coronavirus?
Well, I think that we've seen some folks already do it, but it's just the fact that you continue to have to pivot and shift. And when you talk about trends, it's no more for a year or half a year. It's like, what are they doing today, and how do we react today, and can we react today, and what does that look like going forward? Will it settle down? Obviously, the big question for everybody: will there be a vaccine, and what does that mean, and when will it stabilize, and when will we be able to go back to some sort of normalcy to help the supply chain and demand? And I think those continue to be the biggest threats. I think it's very simply as the unknowns, and what does that mean, and how do we react to those, and how are we able to provide those same resources to the consumer that we always have in a retail environment, brick and mortar, that therefore can help the wholesaler and supplier and the whole chain, the whole funnel, from food service to the restaurant world, to the dairy farmers, you name it. I mean, it all goes together in big, huge pieces of puzzles, and how do we put those all together to get back to the big picture?
And Dave, you know, at the sort of the early side of the value chain, what are the biggest threats and opportunities in your opinion as a result of the coronavirus?
I think the biggest one is, it's not over yet. We're still not certain what direction we are going. One thing we're seeing, that with the loss in the food service business, some of those players are trying to enter the retail side a little bit. So we're seeing a little more competition in some of our markets where we normally have not seen that. So the risk there is going to be margin compression. Dairy margins are extremely tight to start with. And if a new player comes in and starts, doing an RFP with lower prices, it's going to shrink an already tight margin environment. So I think that's the biggest threat that we see. On the opportunity side, in our own business, we had kind of lost our way a little bit, or gotten off track. We were trying to be too many things to too many people. And we've instituted a SIOPS process, which is sales, inventory, operation planning. In our case, we should probably add supply to that, but we've been trying to match up our markets with the manufacturing, with the supply, and then also rationalize our plant network and the markets to work hard on what we're good at, where we make money, and the places that we're maybe not quite as good at and maybe not as profitable, evaluate whether we stay in those markets and that manufacturing or not.
Excellent. Thank you, Dave. I'm going to go back to you, Dave, for to start this question. Within your actual place of business, did the virus impact operations, or did you find yourselves unscathed?
It had a minor impact on operations. I know in our headquarters building, most of those people were sent home and have been working from home. On the manufacturing side, one advantage that a dairy plant has compared to meat packing plants is we have usually a lot warmer environment, and we are spread out a little bit more. So we did have a couple positive cases in a warehouse, and we had to quarantine them, and 2 or 3 of the people that were close to them had to quarantine as well. But we were able to get through it without having any shutdowns in any of our processes, knock on wood to this point. That's not to say we still couldn't have that. That's a big thing that management worries about, being able to keep the doors open on everything and not have to shut down a major cheese plant if we have an outbreak there.
Excellent. Thank you, Dave. Whitney, probably a broader question within that context. Within the value chain, where do you see the virus has the highest propensity per se to impact operations? At the processing level, or what do you think?
Oh gosh, I would say, I don't know that there's a level that is more impacted than the other. I mean, obviously it starts, and Dave just talked about the implications and what could happen in a manufacturing site. And then if you turn around and simply just at the end of that, so to speak, I guess from a retailer and supplier on that end is getting the people back into those buying habits and brick and mortar. And I guess if you look at it from self-service and restaurant and all the things that are needed for ingredients or schools or whatever the case may be where that is, I think that that's a huge impact of just opening that back up again and being able for folks like Dave and Foremost Farms and suppliers to be able to supply that once that happens. And what are those plans, because that's going to happen, and are they going to how are they ready when that happens? Let's hope overnight and sooner than later.
Sure. Thank you, Whitney. Last question, and probably something that I think is extremely important for the group, meaning, this is where I think folks will really learn in the future. Industry-wide, Whitney, are there any innovative lessons that have been learned and deployed as a result of the virus? Or what would you share as a lesson learned, if you will, with folks that watch this?
Yeah, I think lesson learned is always be prepared for the unexpected. I don't think any of us, and I say that with the fact that none of us could really be prepared for something that has impacted every industry, every segment. I don't think any of us were prepared for that. But I heard the other day, you have to innovate, you have to pivot. And how do you do that? How do you communicate and be ready to do that to your teams, your associates, in your industry? I think that's the biggest thing that I would say from my chair and my perspective is just be ready. I think that, if you look at this, I heard somebody say the other day, it's not a matter of if this will happen again, but when. And how do we all take lessons from that and learn from that and be ready to react for every segment of the business and industry at that point, because this is something that is impacting everyone. No one's immune to it. So how do we address it, and how do we prepare for it the next time?
Thank you, Whitney. And Dave, within your operation, which is large in scope, any innovative lessons you could share with the group?
I think the biggest one I would dovetail with Whitney is the chance to learn that our group could really plan and pivot quickly. They were making some plans and looking at rationalization of some plants, and we ended up changing one of those decisions in short order. So that's the best lesson, I think, knowing that you have to be able to pivot at times. You can't get tunnel vision and say we're going one direction come hell or high water. And then the other one is we found out that we don't need everyone, in the office or at all times. People will work from home or remotely and can do a good job doing so. I think that's something everyone wondered before this happened. Can people actually still do their job if they're not walking through the door and being, watched or under the nose of management all day long? So.
Good point.
Excellent. Thank you, Dave. Well, I would like to thank Whitney Atkins and Dave Scavell for joining us today and providing your unique insight into the industry. Is there anything else you'd like to share?
No, James, thanks for the opportunity. I look forward to continuing the conversations. Appreciate meeting Dave as well and learning from him. So great insight to help me as well. So appreciate the opportunity.
Likewise, Whitney. I guess I would just, add thank you for the chance. And we are working hard in the dairy industry to keep everybody supplied and make sure the U.S. and the world get what they need when they need it. So.
Well, thank you both so much. Please join us next time for beef panels, produce panels, transportation, a number of components that will impact the supply chain. And thank you for joining us today.